A spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism. When those words were set down on paper as a manifesto in 1848, amid the sooty fumes of the Industrial Revolution and the shadows of factories steeped in misery, no one could have imagined that they would one day bring down a vast empire across the endless, snow-covered steppes of Russia. Now, set aside everything you think you know from history books. Today, you're not merely witnessing the biography of a political leader, but the construction, through blood, steel, and unyielding resolve, of an idea that split the world in two, dethroned kings, and halted the turning of factory wheels. Before you stands the ominous nightmare that robbed Tsarist Russia of sleep, the undisputed leader of the working class, and one of the greatest social engineers of modern history, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. These rare images, drifting from dusty archives and the dark corridors of history, tell not only of a bygone past, but also of the fractures and roots of the world order we still inhabit today. If you are ready, we plunge into humanity's greatest breaking point, the cold, dark, revolutionary atmosphere of 1917. When Vladimir Ulyanov opened his eyes to the world in the town of Simbirsk, along the banks of the Volga, the globe was still ruled by tsars and emperors who believed their authority to be divinely ordained. On paper, young Vladimir's path seemed that of a quiet intellectual, yet in his mind, Karl Marx's Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto raged like a storm. For him, communism was not merely an economic theory or a philosophy destined to gather dust on library shelves. It was humanity's prescription for liberation from thousands of years of exploitation, the final chapter in the ancient struggle between oppressor and oppressed. He envisioned a world in which the means of production, land, factories and mines, were not the private property of individuals, but united in the collective spirit of society. With unshakable conviction, he believed in the possibility of a classless society, the end of money's dominion, and a world without private property. This belief was not abstract. The execution of his brother Alexander, accused of plotting to assassinate the Tsar, transformed Vladimir's theoretical fire into personal vengeance and social fury. From that day on, Ulyanov died, and Lenin, the cold face of revolution, was born. He devoted his life to becoming a professional revolutionary, scripting every moment as if it were a war strategy. He did not merely read and memorize Marxism, he surgically adapted it to the harsh, unforgiving, semi-feudal realities of Russia. To Lenin, the working class on its own could attain only trade union consciousness. For revolution, it required guidance from a disciplined, uncompromising vanguard party. Thus was laid the foundation of the Bolshevik Party, history's most disciplined political machine. Years of exile, Siberia's frozen silence and Europe's foreign streets never broke him. On the contrary, in the smoky cafes of Switzerland and the vast libraries of London, he crafted the constitution of revolution, line by line, word by word. It was here he sharpened communism's most cutting blade, the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat. In his view, there was no room for mercy in dismantling the old world. He declared global war against imperialism, which he saw as capitalism's final and highest stage. When the First World War erupted and millions slaughtered one another, Lenin went so far as to advocate the defeat of his own country, the Russian Empire. To him, the war was merely an imperialist struggle for division and plunder, and only the system's collapse could bring true freedom. As the Russian people perished in hunger and despair at the front, Lenin traveled back to Russia in a sealed train, like a biological weapon poised to alter the course of history. When he stepped onto the Finland station in Petrograd, he carried not money, but ideas capable of shaking the world. Standing atop an armored vehicle, he thundered, "Peace, bread, and land," and the promise struck the desperate masses like lightning. When he published the April Theses, he shocked even his comrades. No more democratic reforms or halfway measures, he demanded a full socialist revolution, the complete transfer of property, and absolute power to the workers' councils, the Soviets. The indecision of the provisional government and the unending horror of war became Lenin's greatest allies. Factory machines fell silent, soldiers in barracks laid down their arms, and the cry, "All power to the Soviets," rose across Russia like a swelling chorus. Lenin waited for that fragile, decisive moment in history with the focus of a hunter. On the night of October 24th, when telegraph offices, bridges, and banks were seized, the world would never be the same. As Bolshevik sailors and workers broke through the gates of the Winter Palace, it was not merely a building that fell, but a 1,000-year autocracy, and the shadow of the Romanov dynasty swept into history's dustbin. When he rose to speak at the Smolny Institute that night, there was not triumph in his eyes, but the glint of an immense struggle just beginning. He declared himself not only the leader of Russia, but the natural champion of the world, us oppressed and colonized peoples. Communism was no longer a dusty page in a library book. It was a red banner burning like an ember atop the ancient towers of the Kremlin. That banner symbolized not only class vengeance, but the ambition to create a new man, to reconstruct nature and society itself. Yet the blood to be shed, the suffering to be endured, and the labor camps to be established in building this utopia were only beginning. Thus commenced the most audacious, most daring, and most violent social experiment in human history, under Lenin's iron fist and unbreakable will. Across Russia, factories changed hands, and peasants seized lands that had belonged to their masters for centuries. Amid this chaos, Lenin rebuilt order with the cool precision of a surgeon. The nationalization of banks, the repudiation of foreign debts, and the abolition of all ranks of the old regime were the first tremors of the new state, but enemies lurked not only abroad, but within. Aristocrats, wealthy landowners, and former Tsarist officers had no intention of accepting this new order. Russia descended into one of the most brutal and complex civil wars in history. When Lenin unleashed the mechanism of the Red Terror to defend the revolution, he argued it was not a choice, but a necessity. The revolution, he believed, would either crush its enemies or be crushed by them. There was no gray zone. The Cheka, established to combat counter-revolutionary movements and sabotage, became the eyes and ears of the new regime. As the people struggled with famine, the Red Army defended the honor of the revolution on the front lines. Every order Lenin gave rewrote the destiny of a nation. Every speech convinced the masses of the impossible. Russia was no longer merely a country, it was the fortress of a world revolution. From the snow-covered streets of Moscow arose a will that promised not only a new regime, but an end to man's domination over man. Yet the birth pains of this new age would be as merciless as the harshest winter rising over the ruins of an empire. The first morning of power marked not only a victory, but the beginning of one of the greatest upheavals in history. As Lenin walked through the cold corridors of the Kremlin, he carried not merely a decree in his hand, but the wreckage of a collapsed empire. His first act was to honor his promise to the people by signing the decree on peace. Yet this peace came at a heavy cost through the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which meant sacrificing vast territories of Russia. Many of his comrades viewed the decision as betrayal, but Lenin was a strategist. He chose to surrender space in order to gain time and save the revolution. While peace was secured abroad, the gates of hell opened within. When the White Army, monarchists, and the Allied powers, determined to strangle the revolution, attacked from every direction, Russia fell into the grip of a bloody civil war. At this critical juncture, Lenin did not hesitate. He granted Leon Trotsky the authority to build the Red Army, and behind the front lines proclaimed the policy of war communism. This meant requisitioning grain from the peasants and dedicating everything to the front, to the survival of the revolution. Hunger, epidemics, and cold claimed more lives than bullets. In 1918, when bullets fired by Fanny Kaplan struck Lenin outside a factory, the revolution seemed to hold its breath. Surviving the brink of death, the leader responded to the assassination attempt with the Red Terror. Now the revolution, in order to survive, had begun grinding both its enemies and its own like cogs in a ruthless machine. When the smoke of civil war cleared and the Red Army declared definitive victory, Russia resembled a vast graveyard. The economy had collapsed, factories stood silent, and the people's patience was exhausted. Demonstrating ideological flexibility once again, Lenin introduced a new economic policy, NEP. It was a small retreat on the road to socialism, allowing peasants to engage in limited trade in order to end famine. One step back, two steps forward, he argued, persuading his comrades. By 1922, he had established not only a regime, but a vast geopolitical entity, the Soviet Socialist Republics Union. This unprecedented structure blended the principle of national self-determination with socialist centralism. Yet Lenin's exhausted body could no longer bear the immense weight. A series of strokes began imprisoning his sharp mind within a failing body. Even in retreat at his home in Gorky, he watched with concern the growing bureaucratization within the party and the rising ambitions among its ranks. In his final months, before losing his ability to speak, he dictated what became known as his testament. In it, he issued sharp warnings about the unchecked power and coarse character of Joseph Stalin. He urged that someone broader-minded, more loyal, and less authoritarian should lead the party, yet these warnings would not alter the course of history. On January 25th, 1924, when the revolutionary heart that had shaken the modern world ceased to beat, it was not merely a man who died. The symbol of an ideology was immortalized. Against his own wishes and despite his family's objections, his body was embalmed and placed in the mausoleum in Red Square. He became, in effect, a living deity before whom millions would pass each year. Lenin's legacy was immense, a superpower left in his wake, a doctrine that transformed millions of lives, and debates that have never truly ended. To some, he was a prophet heralding humanity's liberation. To others, the ruthless architect of a totalitarian order. Yet one fact remains indisputable. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin was the man who carried ideas down from library shelves into the streets, the squares, and the very heart of history. These faded archival images continue to show us not only a revolution, but how the will of a single individual can shift the course of the world. With the red fire he lit across the snow-covered steppes, he painted the 20th century from beginning to end and etched his memory into the deepest grooves of history.